Hi, everybody. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Agronomists. This is going to be a fun one. I guarantee it. So a few housekeeping items before we get rolling here. If it's your first time joining us, The Agronomists, please let us know in the comments whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. There's a chance to win a hat, which that will be a key point in just a few moments when you see who my guest is. All right. Also, for watching tonight, you do qualify for CEU credits if that's something you like to collect. But you have to head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning to sign up for your CEU credits. And you only have 4 weeks to let us know that you watch. So please do that. Shout out to Warren Steckenberger, who just said hello. Glad to see you here. All right. So who else is here? My two guests, and I am so excited. Ray Dowbenko from Calgary, or a tanning bed. We're not sure because we're having some lighting issues. And Peter Weepy Johnson. And look, there's the hat. Yes. All right.
Absolutely.
So everyone, woo! Finally. So we had to twist Sean's arm, but we were like, finally, okay, we can send one to Wee Pete. After 6 years of Wee Pete's bird, we figure he's sticking around. So there you go. It's beautiful, Pete. Good job. Okay, I don't have a hat now.
Very happy. Pete got a hat. That's good.
Yeah. So Ray, I don't see that you're wearing a hat. So I feel like
no, but I brought you something, Lyndsey. I know you like props, so I have Happy Easter Bunny, who's in the tanning bed with me.
Yes, in the tanning bed with you. That's great. So that we'll have roast bunny by the time
Peter,
this is
don't
over.
even talk about animals and Ray in the tanning bed, okay? Don't get started on that one.
But also, I do want to know, Peter did bring the sport coat. He did bring the power move. So here we go. Okay, so tonight's topic, though, which maybe I've mentioned but probably haven't, is nitrogen management. And I have to say, Pete, this might be one of those shows where we had probably enough questions coming in before the show even started to cover the entire hour. It was nuts.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And Lyndsey, oftentimes I will send some questions. You chastise me for that. So I was quiet this time. And guess what? We didn't need to bring questions because there's been lots of uptake and lots of good questions coming in. And that's exactly what we want, is questions that you have. And between Ray and I and Lyndsey, I think we'll do our very best to answer all of them.
Yeah, we absolutely will. But of course, there's plenty of time tonight to ask whatever you want to know from our two agronomists here on nitrogen. I will mention we do have a couple clips lined up for the show, and we'll get to our first one relatively early, not quite yet, but soon, just because it sort of lays out all the ways we lose nitrogen, and I've dubbed it 50 ways to lose your N. A play on 50 ways to lose your lover, with apologies. 50 ways.
We're not sure if Ray's looking for 50 ways to lose the animals in his tanning bed with him or what.
Right.
Hey, I can't help this. This is just the way it turned out. You guys are the first time this has happened. Usually I look normal as I can look, okay?
Right.
So.
Yeah. We did try. So everyone following along at home, we tried many things to try and get Ray's camera to fix itself.
I think I like this look.
Well, you know what? You do look very relaxed. So that's good.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So, but I do want to relatively quickly go to clip which unheard. But Ray, I want you to set the scene for us on the importance of using as much nitrogen as we put down and limiting those losses. What is the enormity of what we're trying to do here?
Well, I think obviously a difference a bit between west and east when you look at the climate differential. And typically in the prairies, we're moisture challenged. On the east, I could say usually you're at a moisture surplus. So for us, it's a little different following the 4R nutrient stewardship and thinking about how to manage our nitrogen. But with increased yields, we're putting a lot more nitrogen down earlier, and that predisposes us to potential for loss. If the crop's not growing, you're looking at the opportunity for nitrogen loss, and you need to look at situations very specific. I think if you start looking at the nitrogen cycle and what forms nitrogen are in at different times of the year and what loss mechanisms we have, you get a good idea of how you should manage your nitrogen. So whether it's leaching or denitrification. I think we have to be cognizant of those things, and we have to manage our nitrogen better based on application methods and the technology that we're going to talk about that can reduce some of those potential for losses.
Absolutely. And that cues us up
And
perfectly. Oh, go ahead, Pete.
He was going to add
I
something.
just want to jump in. I just want to
Got it.
jump in because like Ray absolutely nailed kind of those things. But when you said the enormity of how this impacts, like it really does become not only a financial cost to the grower. If you over apply nitrogen and you lose a bunch of that nitrogen, it's a negative impact on the bottom line. But in the UK right now, they may lose urea entirely. Urea fertilizer may be banned in the UK because of the losses you can get through volatilization and the ammonia that comes off and the impact, the negative impact that has on the environment. So these environmental consequences, the greenhouse gases, we don't talk a lot about that, but it's huge in terms of the impact that it could have on agriculture. So we really do need to, as we go through this, remember the enormity of some of those decisions or some of those impacts could have on us as farmers.
And before you start the next tip, Lyndsey, I'm gonna jump in on Peter's comment because it's very well founded. You know, typically, as I said, in the West, we're not as concerned because of our environment, but doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned. And he mentions the EU, and if I think about Germany, urea nitrogen can't be applied without some type of inhibitor. It's the law in a lot of places. You have to have an inhibitor to apply nitrogen fertilizer. And we're not there yet, and we don't want to be there, but certainly we have to be cognizant of that. And Peter's right. No matter how small the losses are, they all roll up over millions of acres. And we start talking about, for example, nitrous oxide emissions and a 312 kind of multiplier on that from a CO2 equivalent. It becomes very, very important, and we do need on the world scale to look at that.
Mm-hmm. And frankly, I think you're both bang on that, we're not at the regulatory point that many of these other places are, but we are moving in that direction, at least from our government's point of view on the offset system, on what we're working on. Nitrogen fertilizer was one of the few agriculture topics singled out on some of these carbon offset regulations. So this is absolutely, as you said, Pete, it's a financial thing, and absolutely, we want every dollar we spend of that nitrogen fertilizer to actually go towards yield for financial reasons, but realistically, it's an environmental decision as well. So now we're going to go, setting that all up, we're going to hear from John Hurd, and this, I believe it's a corn school with Calvin Hepner, and I want everyone to pay close attention to one of the first sentences he says, which he refers to, this is something we should all have in our back pocket, and you're going to see what he figures we should be carrying around. I thought it was hilarious. Okay, so producer Jay, let's go to that clip of John Hurd.
Taylors, this has kind of become compulsory to have in your back pocket now, because now that there are some improved products that can actually help us combat some of these losses, it's very important to know where to target those with specific farmers, their equipment and their timing, and then where they should be employing some of those specialty fertilizers. But the real culprit with losses is once nitrogen is in the nitrate form, and mentioned the leaching is what occurs on our sandy or soils where that nitrogen can move below the root zone. But really of great interest is the denitrification. And when soils are saturated, when it's warm right now, within 24 hours, the microbes will consume oxygen in the soil, and then they'll start to denitrify nitrate. Our made in Manitoba thumb rule is that in the spring, when the soils are cool, that we can lose 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day. But now that things are 20 degrees soil temperatures, we'll lose threefold that. Maybe we're losing 8 to 16 pounds per day. And I think many of the states use similar values. So standing water on fields right now, not only is it impairing plants, like we see yellow crops, that's oxygen deficiency in addition to nitrogen. And a particular concern here is the nitrous oxide loss, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And it's interesting at the school here where we're talking about that. And with the specialty products, the inhibitors and controlled release products or others, sometimes we show agronomic advantages, particularly in years when there are losses. But up there on the hill where they're talking about the environmental losses, frequently we show environmental advantages. Many of these products are actually quite effective at minimizing or reducing the nitrous oxide losses. And so it's interesting when the environmental benefits are apparent before some of the agronomic benefits.
This would be a year, though, where you would expect to see value for inhibitors?
Yes. We started out very dry here. We went 34 days without rain until late May, and then we've had more than normal rainfall. So particularly for those plants that are late season that weren't using much water early, like corn or others, they're ones where we would expect that if nitrogen had moved to the nitrate form, it's vulnerable to some of these losses. Again, for those that are crop advisors or ag retailers, and if they know what the farmer's soil is like and what their potential losses and their timing, then they may be able to, with some of the improved products, be able to target those activities at the red circles, which are the losses.
Risk, of course, wouldn't be exactly the same throughout a field. Do you see a day sometime when we alternate or have variable sources, perhaps using urea?
Yeah, that's my wish list. I hope the government can afford to keep me on the payroll. Or well, I hope they don't pension me off before we see farmers applying, in low-risk areas of the field, low-risk areas of losses, like maybe well-drained areas. There may be urea or anhydrous ammonia is quite suitable. But as they move to maybe lower landscapes or sandy ridges or things, then products that tend to stabilize nitrogen more in the ammonium form or control the release may have a particular advantage in those high-risk areas.
All right. Nothing like that happening at this point, though?
Not that I'm aware of. Actually, I expect that there are some farmers probably dabbling at this. And some of the precision ag agronomists may be doing a bit of this, but not widely yet.
Okay. Mm-hmm. It's more of an intuitive thing too, not necessarily that there's science or research showing.
Yes, but if I'm looking for a greater likelihood of payback on some of these more expensive products, I would be putting it into that wet environment or to that environment where it's coarse sand where nitrogen may leach. Just intuitively, that would be targets where my higher priced products would pay for themselves.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So I made a lot of notes. Oh, we've changed hats. I cannot wait to see how many hats we see tonight.
Oh no, just two. Honestly. But I'm a John Hurd one now. He's one of my mentors. It's like
Soil Safari John. He now has Twitter. We used to call him lovingly Twitterless John Hurd, but he did, in fact, eventually join Twitter. And so now we can't call him that anymore. So I made a whole bunch of notes because there's a lot going on in that. But most importantly, I envisioned, because I took what he said literally, because sometimes I do that, like trying to fit that big card in your back pocket when you're headed to the field, instead of course, this concept of all the ways, the 50 ways that we can lose our N. So he does mention, of course, picking areas of the field or a particular field that might be a better fit for some of the protected products. And I don't want to go there quite yet, because first and foremost, I think a quick review of how we lose N and what forms are at highest risk is actually really important. So Ray, I'm going to go to you first.
Hey, that's great. And then Pete can pick up after me and fill in the gaps.
There you go.
He's much brighter. He's much brighter. So I said it to start before you showed that clip, understanding the nitrogen cycle. What are the inputs? What are the outflows? What forms of nitrogen are more predisposed to loss? And John was pointing that out. Once, nitrogen changes, if we're using urea, from urea hydrolyzes to ammonium. Ammonium goes to nitrate. Nitrate is mobile. We lose nitrate through leaching or through denitrification. I think it behooves, and I'll use that word, growers, producers, retailers, everybody to understand the nitrogen cycle and what it means for different forms of nitrogen in terms of losses. So when you have nitrate, as John mentioned, we have leaching potential. We also have denitrification potential. So depending upon the soil conditions, again, situationally specific, certain areas of the field more predisposed to loss than others. So we have to be aware of that. And that helps a lot when you start looking at enhanced efficiency fertilizers, inhibitors, stabilizers, controlled release nitrogen, where they fit. John made another point about, the high ground, the low ground, understanding where the losses occur. So back in my younger days, we had a program at the University of Missouri looking at an algorithm that would help us use these products in certain areas of the field. As John mentioned, and John's going to mention, they're expensive. You only use them where they need to. Well, that makes economic sense, right? If you're trying to protect against the loss, understand why the loss occurs, understand where it occurs, understand the tool that can help you reduce that loss, and then only use that tool when you need to. It's not an excuse for bad management. It is a tool to offset certain situations. And I think John made that comment about variable rate technology. If we can have variable rate technology to apply fertilizer, we have variable rate technology to apply enhanced efficiency fertilizers. Only use them where they make sense.
Pete, is that
Yeah.
it? Or
And
No, I'm going to stop
everyone.
there. Pete's
I was
going
gonna
to
say,
jump
Pete's
in
now
and
gonna
fill in the gap.
This is
Yeah.
why I planned this
So-
evening.
So I really think because Ray went through it very well, but I just want to zero in on the areas where growers need to be concerned, and one is with volatilization, and so volatilization really is a urea component. If you're using anhydrous ammonia, the chances you can lose it if you don't close the slot, certainly with anhydrous ammonia. But as long as you're closing the slot, volatilization isn't a big deal with ammonium nitrate. So 28% nitrogen, 32% nitrogen is half urea, half ammonium nitrate. So really it's that urea component where we worry about the volatility. And the more likely or the greater the risk of volatility comes with high winds, soil surface applications, or open slots. If you don't close the slot, you can get loss in a band as well. But if you incorporate, you tend mostly to get less worry about volatility. But really that volatility is on the surface. So winter wheat right now, volatility of urea applications on winter wheat is something that you have to have in the back of your brain. And the other one is when it goes to nitrate. And when it goes to nitrate, we can get leaching, but leaching typically in season worries me way less. Even on a sand soil, it takes a lot of rain to leach that in season out of the root zone. It can happen, 6 inches of rain for sure, but leaching is really a wintertime issue, much more so than an in-season issue. So once it gets to the nitrate form, then it is the denitrification. And I mean, leaching is bad in terms of moving nitrogen into the groundwater, but it isn't the same environmental impact from a greenhouse gas standpoint as the denitrification. And so heavy clay soils, denitrification, any time that the soil is going to stay wet for an extended period of time, that's when your denitrification losses really ramp up. So growers need to focus on those two losses and understand those two losses. And if they can understand those two losses and their soil conditions, then they can make a much better informed decision on when it's appropriate to use a protected nitrogen or to protect the nitrogen you're applying versus when you don't really need that, and it will be an economic cost that maybe doesn't bring any real benefit to you or the environment for that perspective.
So Pete caught me being a homer, being a Western guy growing up in Manitoba and living in Alberta now. So typically we don't spread or broadcast a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. More so now in the last few years we are, for different reasons on different farms, farm size and what have you. So the volatile loss I skipped over, and I'm going to say a mea culpa on that. I shouldn't have done that. And when we talk about stabilized nitrogen, you start spreading nitrogen, as Pete mentioned, you look at environmental conditions, cool soils, rainfall within a short period of time, incorporation, but on winter wheat in Pete's world, you can't do that. So we do need to look at protecting our nitrogen if we're going to be surface supplying. And as Pete mentioned, those types of conditions where we have, coarse textured soils, low organic matter, limited rainfall, moist soil that partially dissolves the fertilizer, leaves it on the surface, where we have the volatile loss. We have particulate matter from ammonia emissions. So the stabilized nitrogen products fit very well there. Typically, if we're looking at split applications and you're making an application in June or July, we need to look at a stabilized application as well. So Pete, kudos to you, and thank you for giving me my slap upside the head on the volatilization side. I should have mentioned that, but I did not.
Hey, come on now. I had no idea how tile drainage worked, I think, until I was like 5 years ago. Anyway, so I'm just saying, all right? There are some things in the West we just do differently. Okay, I did want to send a shout out to Les Nichols is watching from Bruce County. So hi, Les. And Alan is here. Hello, Alan. And Jason Vogt has a question. In this same theme, how important is that N inhibitor for volatilization losses if you're applying to dry ground and very little expectation of enough rainfall? In particular, UAN, where only 50% is in the urea form. So, of course, Jason is in Manitoba. It is incredibly dry. And I happen to know of at least one farmer I spoke to today who's potentially rolling tomorrow, which would be the earliest ever. So I'm sure Pete will be pleased. But yes. What's the answer there? How important is that? And when it's dry, how important is that?
I'm going to jump in, Pete. Jason, thanks for the question. I'm sure you're getting your shots back since I've taken them all as well. Now that I'm speaker, I'm going to expect to get them. If I have a dry granule and it's a dry surface, then it stays dry, and the hydrolysis, the urea granule in that case, is very minimal on a dry surface. If I'm introducing UAN, in your case, a 28% nitrogen, and I have a liquid form, I'm starting to get some dissolved material on that surface of the soil, which is probably, using a liquid on a dry soil could be worse than using a dry granule on a dry soil. So you want enough moisture to wash that material in after hydrolysis and dissolution of the granule, the fertilizer material, but just leaving it as mush, scientifically speaking, mush on the surface is a bad thing. So if you're applying liquid UAN on dry surface, you're going to have some particulate matter sitting on the soil surface that's not going to have enough moisture to wash it in. So it may be worse to be using UAN in a dry condition as opposed to a dry granule. Now I'll let Pete jump on that.
Yeah, so and Ray's right again. The dry granule, it's like putting a dry seed in dry soil before it rains. You're putting it in dry storage, so it might as well be in the ground as sitting in the bag. A dry granule is the same thing. With the lick on the soil surface, it totally depends on how much moisture is in that soil. If it's just sitting, basically dries itself out on the soil surface, because we're really not talking about very much liquid, right? We're putting on maybe 40 gallons per acre of 28%. So will it dissolve into or adhere to that very surface soil layer? Absolutely. It really does dry itself out pretty quickly. And so then it's like a dry granule, unless we're getting moisture wicking up from underneath. And if you walk out in the morning and the soil surface is wet, then there better be enough moisture there that it's actually taking some of that nitrogen down in with it, or could get volatilization. The other thing, though, Jason, that I will say, and 100% thanks for the question, like you and I have taken shots back and forth, so that's kind of cool. But the other thing to remember is that it's pretty cold right now, and you're at far less risk of loss under cold soil conditions, not zero loss. So you're never at risk of zero loss. There's always a risk of loss. But right now, that loss would be quite a bit less than it's going to be. And John Hurd's going to talk about this, but you have both of those things kind of going on, that we're under cold soil conditions. And if it's really that dry on the surface, I'm not too worried about that 28% hydrolyzing and turning into ammonia and disappearing, because we just don't have that amount of moisture there.
Okay. Now, so Warren Schneckenberger out from, I'm going to say my neck of the woods because we're a lot closer than you and I say, Pete. But he says, I vote this year in Eastern Ontario. We talk about denitrification for a change instead of volatilization, which I think is a vote for rain, which Warren's not that far from where I am. We're in good shape for moisture. Like I am okay with it, and I feel bad for Western Canada. And I wish I could send you some of it because we're actually.
I think
okay.
this is why Warren's making the comment, because as opposed to being too dry, you have a lot of moisture, and he's concerned about denitrification, as Pete mentioned. So nitrogen in the nitrate form, whether it's a fall apply, which you don't do out east usually, but in the spring, he's concerned about what John mentioned on his tape, is you're going to have warm soil conditions. Nitrogen's going to move from the ammonium form to the nitrate form, and he's voting for denitrification as being his potential concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Now
so
we
can
have
get both absolutely. We
yeah.
can get both absolutely, but denitrification is the bigger concern most of the time here. Having said that, there are years when on my own winter wheat, I will apply a urea inhibitor product to my 28% nitrogen because I'm putting it on a damp soil surface with no rain in the forecast. If my soil surface is damp, now Ray's hydrolysis, where we're looking at getting those losses, become really quite significant. But the soil's dry, so, or relatively dry. So once it moves in, the risk of losses from denitrification still aren't that high. I'm not on a heavy clay soil. I'm on a clay loam to a silt loam. And so all of these factors play. Know your soil type, know your risk.
I want to jump in on Pete's comment, and it plays into Jason. Jason, I would just tell you, if you have any concerns, use the inhibitor and you'll feel better, and it's money well spent, and it's going to be the better thing to do. Now to go to Pete's comment about the surface application and the moisture issue. The one thing that the growers need to consider, in Pete's case, winter wheat, you're applying that UAN on winter wheat, and you're assuming it's going to get to the soil, but you do have a fair bit of vegetative material, and you have to consider that you may not get enough moisture on a thatch layer to wash that into the soil as you would on a bare soil or low residue. So it may actually take more moisture to wash that nitrogen into a winter wheat stand or a pasture stand or a grass stand than it normally does for a tilled field. So if we say that a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch can wash urea into the ground or UAN and you're all good to go, that's one thing. But if you're thinking about a zero till field or a winter wheat field and you're applying nitrogen over the top and you think it's only going to take a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch, you may not find that that's enough because you're going to wash it onto the residue. It's going to sit on the residue until it gets further down into the soil, so you could have immobilization occurring. So it does again become situationally specific, which is why you need to
Ray
call Pete.
wins. Yeah, Ray wins because it's the first time we've mentioned immobilization. So there you go. So
I've
we
been
did manage to
immobilized
get
many
all the
times.
different ways.
Yeah.
But nitrogen immobilization is a thing. So, and I feel like Pete, he's picking on your wheat crop. So
No, not at all.
I know, I'm just Ray, I'm kidding. Besides, you called me creepy last week, but in a loving way, he
I
said.
said
Okay.
with love. I said with love.
I know, with love. Okay, but Pete, we did have, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we did have a couple questions come in on Twitter right before we were going to head to air. There are, of course, many questions, and there will be a wheat school coming up with you and Joanna Fallings that tackle a lot of these nitrogen on winter wheat questions for this spring period. But we do have. Maybe let's answer that question about, is if you're going 100% N right now, is it too early? Is now the time to go? Let's tackle that question first, and then there's more here in the comments we'll get to too.
Yeah. And so absolutely, it's, if you have big wheat, it's too early. And it's too early for some of the reasons Ray talked about in terms of opening yourself up for long potential. So what everybody's noticing right now, and it's cool, like I cannot tell you how excited I am because everybody's actually out in their wheat field digging up wheat plants and counting tillers, and suddenly wheat is a real crop. It's almost as big as corn or canola in Western Canada. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable, Lyndsey. It really is. But what they're noticing is that the wheat plant's making all sorts of more tillers, and they're saying, well, like, how do I count these tillers, and what's the big deal? Why don't I just put all the nitrogen on now and be done with it? Well, just go back, and I'm going to liken it to corn for just a second, because if we side dress corn, and some of the comments in Twitter were talking about, well, it's only 2 weeks in between when I put my first shot on and second shot on. Well, I just put it all on at once. In corn, if we put all the nitrogen up front, we come back 4 weeks later and side dress, we always know it takes 10% less nitrogen in the corn crop if we side dress versus all up front. That's a loss factor. There's no other reason for it but a loss factor. So all up front, lose 10% nitrogen. And in corn, 4 weeks is a big deal. And corn grows from, the 1st of May till the 30th of September or the 15th of October. It's got a much longer growing window, but 2 or 3 weeks in the wheat crop isn't enough to make a difference. That's ridiculous. That 2 or 3 weeks makes a huge difference in the stem elongation and on how much that wheat crop is going to lodge. So I really think, number one, it's too early on big wheat, and in small wheat, you should hit it already. You should have already had the nitrogen on. But on big wheat that's got lots of tillers, if you apply the nitrogen now, particularly if you apply the full shot now, you're at risk for loss. You're going to support all those small tillers that are never going to make a head. The one tweet today from Dennis was 235 heads per square foot. Like, we hope that we can get 60 or 70. In our dreams, we get to 100 or 110 heads per square foot. Like, you can't support that. So if the wheat plant puts a bunch of resources into tillers that don't go to head, it's sort of a waste of those resources. It's not a total waste, but it is a waste. You open yourself up to loss. You try to support tillers that are never going to do you any good, and you make it all go to vegetative growth, so it's going to fall over flat. You want to do it right. You're going to split your nitrogen, and on that big wheat, you're going to wait, because you don't want to apply the nitrogen to support those late tillers. So you wait till it goes reproductive, growth stage 30, and that's when you put on the first shot of nitrogen.
There we go. So now that
I want to toss in a Western comment. So Pete mentioned the lodging. Definitely, that is a big problem that we would see with that early application and all up front. The other one is forcing that plant to use more moisture when we're going to be moisture challenged a little bit later. So a lot of vegetative growth early, a lot of water being used for vegetative growth that's not going to support grain yield. So for what Pete says, it makes perfect sense out east, but it also makes perfect sense out west.
Whoa. Easy. We need to keep them in check sometimes, right?
I'm just showing the love. Just showing the love.
Yeah, so I think this answers Doug McComb's question of saying, don't we get much less volatilization now in spring versus summer? So why wouldn't it be safe to put some N on my wheat, and does soil temp matter? But Pete, you're saying if it's small wheat, it should have had a shot by now. It's the big wheat you're worried about, the stuff that doesn't need encouragement to put up more tillers.
Yeah, and so if you have the in-between wheat, because there's wheat that is sort of in between, it's not really small, it's not got tons of fall tillers, then for sure, some nitrogen right now on that wheat so it can support some of those spring tillers. Absolutely fair. But wheat's a funny beast because it doesn't take many days difference in planting in the fall to go from, what's going to be really big wheat with lots of tillers. And then a week later, you get into wheat that's just sort of mediocre. A week after that, you've got tiny wheat because of how the fall works here. And so there's not a lot of wheat that really would be getting fertilized at this stage. You either wait until growth stage 30 or you're already done on most of the wheat.
Yeah, I think I have to separate out two things in Doug's comment on the Twitter was, the volatilization potential. And yes, it's lower when it's cooler. But what Pete's talking about is the efficiency for the crop. It's not necessarily the right thing to do. So from a nitrogen management perspective, yes, it's a good thing. but from a growth perspective, it's not a good thing. So you're kind of stuck there.
Yeah. And soil temperature, by the way, always matters. Always,
Yes.
soil temperature always matters.
Now, what it matters for, we're not sure, but let's just say it always matters. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so John here says, around that idea, what would be the ideal, in air quotes, I like them, temperature to surface apply 28 or 32%, and what is a good rule of thumb for getting that surface applied product incorporated? Who wants to grab that one?
Well,
Is there an
Peter, they
ideal
mentioned
temperature?
28 or 32, and 32 is kind of foreign in the West because
That's
it just salts out too quick for us with our cold temperature. So if you want to take a shot first, and I'll weigh in after.
Yeah. So by the way, we only use 32 if we can get it in season. If we're storing over winter, we're still 28%, just like you guys are out west, Ray. But as far as what is an ideal temperature, well, if you're going to incorporate it, then temperature doesn't become nearly as important as long as you do a good job of incorporation. And if it's on the soil surface, then the lower the temperature, the better that is, because the lower the temperature, the less loss or the less risk you're at for losing some of that nitrogen. So ideal temperature, I don't know. I don't like driving on wheat when it's minus 12 Celsius. If you drive on wheat when it's minus 12 Celsius, the wheat leaves actually get frozen enough that the tires will damage the wheat leaves. But between about minus 10 and anywhere from there up until probably plus 5, the risk of loss is pretty low. And then it slowly increases. And the warmer it is, the more risk you're at for loss.
So for John's question, I'd have to ask, is it just about applying the fertilizer, or is he applying it to a crop situation? If it's just about applying the fertilizer, I'm with Pete. Cooler is better, and you'd want at least 1.5 to 2 inches of incorporation. But if you've got, a winter wheat crop coming up, you're not going to incorporate it unless you're wiping out the stand. And so then, you look at temperature about, I would say 5 degrees Celsius and lower, but there's been work in Montana showing that we get volatile losses even under cooler conditions. But I will say there's a caveat on that research, is that a lot of that application was going into soils that were almost at field capacity. So when you put it on frozen ground with a lot of water in it, and then it thaws in January, February, you've got the moisture to cause the hydrolysis. But if it goes in like most prairie soils, very, very dry, it's not such a big deal. So I just had to add that extra comment to John is, are you just applying the nitrogen to ground, or is it to a crop?
Yeah. And never on snow.
Not
Never
ever.
on snow.
Anyone even asked that question, and they don't even with me. Okay. So although I will
weigh in on that one because I have my own comments about snows. That's okay.
Well,
and it's not yellow snow, Lyndsey. It's about the depth of snow. Urea can melt ice down to about -7, -10 C, and it'll go through roughly 1 inch to 2 inches of snow. As long as there's not a frozen ice layer, it's not always a horrendous situation. But when it just hangs up on the soil surface, on the ice layer, then you get those volatile conditions, you get runoff, you get a lot of bad things. So 6 inches of snow, not a good thing. We don't want bad things,
No.
Lyndsey. No bad things.
We don't. We want all good things. So there you go. All right. So Farmer Warren Schneckenberger, has a great question that works into the comment that you had, Ray, about, is this onto residue? Is this onto leaf tissue? All those sorts of things. So using streamer bars to apply UAN to wheat, what amount of rain is needed to incorporate?
Yeah. And so
Pete lives there. Go for it.
Yeah, no. And so the beauty of streamer bars or streamers is that we're making raindrops. And so typically we don't get much hang up on the plant material. We don't want hang up on the plant material, because if we do, we get leaf burn. And so that's why I push growers to use, the streamer bars, because they make big droplets and they're dropping them straight down like a raindrop would, and they bounce off as a general rule. You don't want to do it. By the way, don't ever put 28% on wheat that has white frost on it. If you have white frost on it, it will adhere that fertilizer to the leaf and it will just smoke the crop. A couple of years ago, I forgot to mention that to a grower. Oh, it was nasty. So don't do that. But you have big droplets. Big droplets tend to have enough moisture there that they bounce off the leaf material, and they'll even roll off some of the residue, not necessarily all of the residue, but some of the residue. So then it becomes more along the lines of what Ray talked about at the beginning. 1/4 of an inch will generally do a pretty good job of incorporating that. Maybe not 100% of it, but the majority of it. 1/2 an inch for sure, you've got it in the ground. And that's sort of the game we're playing in. The worst is when you get that 1/10 of a rain, and then it dries out, and you get another 1/10 of an inch, and then it dries out. Because every time that happens, you re-wet things, and it's still at the soil surface, and that's when we start to worry about those increased level of losses.
Also, I'd like just to point out that I'm really glad that we went from inches of rain to tenths, but then our rain is given to us in millimeters that fall. So this is something I love about farming. We all just
we brought in the metric system in Western Canada and changed it to millimeters, so growers felt better when they got a certain amount of rain. 50 millimeters. This sounds like so much more. Just like changing your gas from gallons to liters, and it went up 4 times overnight, and people just said, "Oh, that's the metric system. It's okay."
Well, and it's why when back in many moons ago, when I used to run, I'd always say in kilometers because it sounds further. Anyway, yeah, it's not. Okay. So that's not how distance works. All right. So now Lara, over our Real Agriculture team, Lara has mentioned that this is episode 21, the road to the second clip. We may never get there. It is already 8:45. I don't even know how that happened. So I'm actually going to skip over because the second clip was Brian Barris, and it was a really good chat about some of these different the different products and enhanced products. We've talked a lot about them. We can talk a little bit more, but we would be remiss to talk about nitrogen and not talk split apps. So I'm actually going to skip to our third clip, which is with Paul Sullivan out my way, out here in Kimburn and Egburn, talking in a cornfield in June. I forget which year. This might have been 2 years ago. And we are talking about split application nitrogen. So we'll go to the clip, and then I'm sure there'll be much to discuss after that.
So now you're a big fan of split applications, right?
Yeah.
How do you assess what's in that second split?
Lots of ways of doing it. We use an in test. We use our experience with levels of nitrogen. We assess the crop and see what it looks like. The nitrogen that's applied, we always feel if we split it, we can more appropriately apply the rate that the crop is setting up for. If it's a good crop, the one thing we find is that the crop will probably use more of the nitrogen that is applied, so the efficiency of use is better. We'll get more yield for less nitrogen. If it's a not so good crop, has some issues, some compaction or some water logging, in some cases those fields will definitely need more nitrogen relative to the yield. Nitrogen is a key driver in yield, and we want to make sure it isn't short, and we sometimes have that opportunity after the crop is in and growing like this has been side dressed a couple days now, to be able to say, okay, we're going to put a nitrogen rate on to make sure that nitrogen, it all comes down to nitrogen not limiting to the crop. And we can over apply nitrogen, we can under apply nitrogen, but if we split apply nitrogen, generally we have a better timing so that the nitrogen isn't sitting without the crop there if it's all put on up front.
Final question. Talk about the split and application. What was early, what was late? And you mentioned obviously you just applied a couple of days ago.
Yeah, so this field would have had about 15 pounds in the starter. It had 30 pounds as UAN pre-emerged with the herbicide. And then we came back in here, I believe, with about another 70 pounds of N. So the total N on this particular field is approximately 125 pounds of N. And we expect we can grow 200 bushel corn on this particular field with that much N.
I just like our music. Okay, so now we're it's getting late. Okay. All right. So there's a couple different things to unpack here, of course, in that it really does come down to what crop we're talking about as to what we're considering with the split application of N. I mean, that's the big one. So where do you want to start? Do we want to start on wheat and chasing protein or yield and that discussion? Let's start there, maybe. Because this is definitely one we hear from the West and the East probably just as much, is if I'm going to top dress or split app N, how do I go after protein or how do I go after yield? Can I do both? Peter, tell me we can do both.
Oh yeah, you can do both. Absolutely, you can do both. But the more yield you make, the more nitrogen you make to still keep protein, right? You need more nitrogen to support high protein in high yield wheat. And it's pretty easy kind of thought process to go through. The later you apply, the more likely a higher percentage will go towards protein. So you want most of it to go towards protein. You put that nitrogen application on after heading. 10 days after it heads out, you go in there with 30 pounds of nitrogen. Almost all of that will go to protein. Not necessarily all. We actually thought it would all go to protein. Some of it can go to yield and make bigger kernels. You can't make more kernels anymore, but you can make bigger kernels if you're short nitrogen and you get enough moisture. But this split nitrogen thing, I mean, God, particularly on a year like this in Western Canada, split nitrogen makes so much sense. It makes sense in the corn crop here, as Paul was talking about, because dang it, you can make such a better decision when the corn is already kind of at that 6-leaf stage, that 7-leaf stage, when you're going to go out there and side dress. You can do the nitrogen sample. You can look at the stand. Last year, we had a really cold spring. We had stands out there of 24,000 plants. You all know that your maximum yield potential has been somewhat reduced when you only have a stand of 24,000 plants. If you went out on the 1st of May and put on 200 pounds of nitrogen, the whole shot for the crop, and then you end up with 24,000 plants, it's like you've wasted that money. So split nitrogen always makes you smarter. You can make a better decision on that second application. And then, Lyndsey, you want to get protein? It's simple. Look at the crop at anthesis, at heading, and say, oh my gosh, we got the rain, I got the stand, I got the crop. Well, then we better get in there and add some more nitrogen. And if you're looking at kind of trying to do both yield and protein, then you're probably going to target early flag leaf stage for that second or final application, and hope that you can predict what the weather's going to be like after that. But split nitrogen, I mean, gosh, it just makes sense in so many ways. Plus, it's an environmental, reduces lodging in the wheat crop, makes you smarter. It's an environmental win. What's wrong with split nitrogen?
Well, Ray, is there anything wrong with split nitrogen?
Peter used the word dang it. So that's like the euphemism for I'm all right all the time. And that's fine. But I think you said when you had to unpack it about the crop situation. So, on corn, I see the split application making sense. You're using high rates of nitrogen. You're typically on a sandier, higher loss potential situation. Nothing wrong with split application. In the 90s, and I'm an old guy, when I was doing work on split applications and nitrogen in the prairies, all up front end pretty much did the same thing as split application because we weren't challenged for losses. Now, to Pete's comment about protein, if I want protein, I get a drought, I get high protein because I got low yield. And to Pete's comment again, if you want high yield, Lyndsey, you want it all. Typical Lyndsey wants it all. I want high protein and high yield.
That's
then
right.
You want lots of nitrogen. But then to Pete's comment, you've got to split it because it's risky to put it all on. Right now, in a dry situation, I would counsel growers, I'm putting 60 to 70% on at planting or at seeding. And if the rain comes, I've got moisture probes in the ground, I've got rainfall coming, I'm going to do the in-season application. And then it brings up a whole another set of questions about, is it UAN? Do I dilute it with water? Is it urea dissolved in water? When do I put it on? If you want protein, generally flowering, but anytime after heading is going to be a good time. Prior to stem elongation for yield, but after that, as Pete said, is going more of that nitrogen goes to protein.
Well, and I guess that was my question, I guess, in very dry conditions, like we talked about, if this is when you would use some protected nitrogen, these sorts of things. But when you're going in to such dry conditions, that could potentially significantly cap your yield. Is this a year that a split application really makes sense because you
I
can go
think
in and make the
economically, I would
most of it,
counsel
right?
my family that we would be looking at 60 to 70% of our nitrogen requirement, whether it's wheat or canola, and we'd be going in at seeding time. And then if the rain came, we would start to make plans for either a liquid application as a foliar top dress or streamer bars, or we'll be going for a granular application if we're after yield and we want to get it on early enough so we're going to have time for that to wash into the root zone and get taken up. If we're looking at protein, as Pete says, it's later, and we'd have another set of management conditions for that. But yeah, dry conditions, we reduce our nitrogen application up front, and we look at the split application. So damn it, I guess, oh dang it, I guess Pete's right. What's wrong with split applications? It makes sense.
Nothing. Now, there are, of course, and this is as
Oh.
we're approaching the end of our show, we've got a whole bunch of questions that are coming in. So we are going to get to them. But Lara, here with Real Agriculture, I know that last year she and Wheat Pete had all sorts of discussions about late N, and she says it worked out well. So they did go in, they went in with that late N, they did the split app, and it worked out well for protein, and they got good yield. So thumbs
Yeah,
up,
baby.
it worked.
Yeah, baby.
Yeah. Okay.
The one.
So now, go ahead.
No, just the one thing about the
Yep.
split or the late application. If we
Mhm.
if we do a dry granule, right, we go in there with Amidas. In Ontario, growers love Amidas for that late application, a little bit of sulfur and some nitrogen. Man, if you put that dry granule on top of dry soil and never get a rain, yeah, that's not going to do very much for you. So there is no such thing as a perfect system. There are some things that still need to happen to make that work. But anyway, sorry, carry on with the questions, Lyndsey. My apologies.
Yes, I was going to say, Wheat Pete, I'm trying to keep us on time, and you're going to make me go over by a lot. Anyway, and I'm going to tell Sean it was all you. Okay, so John says, is split still advised for corn if you use a liquid starter on the planter and dry in the strip till at 6 inches on sandy loam? I don't know where John farms, if that matters.
Yeah. So the answer is, I would say still yes. And again, it comes down to those same factors. Put 100 pounds of nitrogen on up front. One of the things we haven't talked at all about that I think is way cool in the corn game is that we're starting to look at the value of nitrogen in the row at planting time. And so Greg Stewart now is talking about doing a nitrate sample in the row at 6-leaf corn, and you better have 50 parts per million of nitrogen in the row area. That's a lot of nitrogen. So having the strip tiller there is perfect. But if you strip till and you put on all the nitrogen, then you better use something like ESN, because number one, all the nitrogen in that band, even at 6 inches, you're getting pretty hot. If you're up 160, 180, some growers now are 200 pounds of nitrogen, man, you could get into some real burn even in that positioning. So you have to start looking at maybe protecting you from a burn perspective by using some polycoated urea, because it's much less burn potential. Plus, it'll become available over time. But you still don't have the advantage of knowing how your crop has done, what the weather's been like, what the stand is like, what kind of a crop yield potential you have at side dress timing. So even in a strip till system, I still like the split nitrogen application. I think it makes you a smarter farmer.
Yeah, I think what John might be getting at is a starter nitrogen enough to carry him until the strip till at depth placement carries him the rest of the way. So he wants to preclude the side dress. And that again becomes situationally specific, as Pete says. If that deep placed nitrogen in the strip is still going to be available, and every year is going to be a little different. So a controlled release product, a polymer coated product, or an inhibitor that stabilizes nitrogen in the ammonium form for 6 to 8 weeks could carry him. And that's what you have to evaluate with these enhanced efficiency fertilizer products. If they can, as John Hurd said, they're going to cost more because they come at a premium, but if they offset the need to make a side dress that may cost $6 or $8 an acre, the premium you pay may put you further ahead. But every year is different, and you have to evaluate that. And you can get Pete to do that because he loves evaluating things.
He really does. Now, Jim has a comment here. Is split end makes you smarter? Variable rate split end makes you a genius. So that's Pete. That's the next thing for your setup there. We highly expect next year that you're going to do variable rate split end. Okay. Eric Pateman has a question here for you, Ray. How much of your research was done in dry years? What are your thoughts on water-driven yield potential technology?
I think water yield driven potential technology is awesome. Sticking a moisture probe in the ground and knowing at what depth your crop is accessing the moisture when it's recharged, it makes for great potential for crop sequencing, for choice of crops in a rotation. And so when I look at that comment about dry years, my research in dry years, is that related to nitrogen? And so obviously if it's related to nitrogen, loss potential is higher in wetter years versus drier years. But if we're looking at water-driven yield potential technology and looking at where should we place enhanced efficiency fertilizers, I think it's a tremendous benefit to understand in your growing areas, your fields, or within your field, where you have conditions for nitrogen loss, because it's all based on moisture. And just like crop yields based on moisture, nitrogen loss is based on moisture as well. So I'm a big thumbs up guy on soil moisture probes, and seeing the graphs and watching where the water is being extracted. And last couple of years we grew some awesome crops in the prairies because the water was 3 or 4 feet down. And if we didn't have moisture probes, we wouldn't have known that. We wouldn't have made good decisions. And making a top dress decision based on moisture that's coming or moisture that we don't know is there. And if you don't know it's there, you'd make a wrong decision. So I'm a big fan, Mr. Pateman, big fan.
There you go. If we have to measure to manage, right? So if we can measure it, we can manage for it. Jason has a point here about PAN, which is post-anthesis application. And so Jason, hats off to you for creating a new acronym because agriculture didn't have enough. Okay, so post-anthesis says 10 gallons per acre of UAM plus 10 gallons per acre of water just as soon as anthesis is completed. Dissolved urea is better since it burns less. So yes, burn is a concern, right, Pete? We do want to make sure that we're not hurting any leaf tissue.
Exactly. And so there's, I really like streamer nozzles in that situation because they burn less, but lots of people have this concept that they'd rather put it on the leaf and then they can get some foliar uptake. You don't get much nitrogen to go in through the leaf most of the time, but regardless, so dissolved urea is better, but do it at night when it's cooler. We have high humidity, and the bigger the droplets, so that unless you're just using low rates and you are using dissolved urea, I really don't like 28% sticking on the leaf because it just burns. It's way too high a salt content, and diluting it helps because you're more volume. It's more likely to roll off the leaf, but you just burn potential is a concern. You burn the flag leaf, it's all bad. Just full stop.
Mm-hmm.
So Jason's looking at a protein influence is what he's after with that application. Post-anthesis is strictly for protein. And yeah, you're going to get leaf scorch, but maybe post-anthesis it's not a big deal or as much a big deal. But to Pete's comment, it's still going to have to wash in. If we get 7 to 10% through leaf absorption, that's kind of what the numbers show, maybe graciously 20%, but it's a small amount, and people would argue it doesn't take much. If we put on 10 pounds of N, it all gets into the crop, get 0.5% protein, but I think that's what Jason's after. And, again, people are looking for uses for their high clearance sprayers after herbicide season is over, after fungicide season is over, to justify, and no, not to be disparaging, but $300,000 investment, damn it, I don't want it to be a pasture ornament, so maybe I can find something to do with it. And it's not always the right thing to do just because you can. So that did sound disparaging, didn't it? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, no, you know what? I think we just have to work on your delivery a bit, Ray. I mean, we need to talk about the economies of scale, and we just need to talk about, that lowering the cost per acre for the ownership.
I'm not necessarily a patient person. I'm sorry about that.
So I'm just, it's not disparaging. But I do think the adage of just because you can doesn't mean you should is always a good good one. And you get 10 points for using the word scorch. I haven't actually been keeping track of the points. I'll make them up at the end. But really, the audience wins. So anyway,
Hey, I'm
I do like the
I'm
word
gonna
scorch.
push it in my favor, Lyndsey. Because you can doesn't mean you should. Peter, you ever tried to pee on an electric fence?
Gosh.
That's something
We
you
were,
should not do just because you
gentlemen, we
can.
were doing so well. We really
And
were.
my brother, my wonderful brother that I love dearly, and like he was the guy that you know, suggested I should do that when I was knee high to a grasshopper. That rotten guy.
Oh, goodness. That's okay. My sisters used to tell me, don't worry, Lenny, you're wearing rubber boots. It won't hurt. Yeah. No, it still hurts. Thanks, girls. Anyway, so Jason says, okay. Oh yeah. Also, Warren would like to buy your high clearance sprayer for 300,000 because he says that's cheap. And Jason says this post-anthesis nitrogen is a flat fan nozzle directed at the head, but Peter's precaution is correct. Why are we directing it at the head? Are we mixing it with fungicide? What are we doing there, Jason? Please expand.
No. You're not mixing it with fungicide. It's too late.
Okay, so why is it directed at the head?
So the thought process is that if we can get it right on the head, that any nitrogen there will immediately go into the grain, right? It's right there by the grain. Plus we get better coverage on the upper leaves. So it really is just trying to increase the level of foliar uptake.
All right, we are running over time here. Big shout out to Margaret May, who says that she's been a guest on the show multiple times. She's been on our set a lot. She's even visited Sean in Picture Butte, and she doesn't have a hat. So we're going to start a club of the people that don't have real ag hats that probably should. Okay, so Margaret, you are one of them, and thanks for watching tonight. And Jason, of course, is clarifying, no, he is that application is never with a fungicide. Peter is correct. It's to aim it at the head. And there you go. It is a beautiful hat. So I did get a hoodie though. Oh, and Margaret has a really nice hoodie. So there you go. Okay, so we didn't get to the one clip that was about nitrogen stabilizers and those products, but we covered it quite a bit. The one point that Brian Barris made that I did want to point out though is he does make the caution of making sure that handling of that product, making sure that we're not ending up with potentially damaging of that product before it actually gets in the ground. So that was one point that was in that video that I just wanted to throw out there. And also, Jason is now making fun of me, saying that we did not have this show in hand because I lost control 2 minutes in. So, Jason, if you have a hat, please return it to me because you don't get one anymore. But you were probably right. Okay.
Hey, Lyndsey, in your defense, Jason, you have to look at who she's dealing with.
So, most of you in the audience don't know that this was all my idea. So here at Real Ag, and that was one thing I wanted to mention. We'll take your comments on, is there a particular show or a topic you want us to tackle? We absolutely will. And so we brainstorm about these things, and then we brainstorm about the kind of, who can speak to it, who do we want? We try and get east and west. And this was all my plan. This was my design. So
Lyndsey, just to help you save face, I am freely available. If any of your listeners have questions that we didn't get to, you have my contact information, whether it's telephone, cell phone, or email. Please let them have it. And I'm happy to, these questions that you ask and what Pete's discussing, it is very deep. It requires more questions, and you've done a great job herding the cats tonight, no doubt. But for anybody that feels they have some specific questions that they'd like to ask, I'm happy to share my time with that. I think what you guys do at Real Ag is wonderful. You're trying to get the message out, share some thoughts, show people that there's resources out there, introduce them to those resources, and I think it's great. So I'm happy to help out if there's a need.
Thank you. And of course, Pete, how do we get a hold of you?
Pete's Word, Twitter, tweet me or text me or email me. And man, if there's questions that Ray has a good answer for, I'll be putting that information up on the Word, because that's I love that system. It's such a two-way street, and have at it.
Yeah. Okay. And for anyone watching, Wheat Pete's Word goes up every Wednesday. There is a new one. We just crossed 300 episodes, which is a fantastic milestone. So every Wednesday, head over to realagriculture.com, or you can listen on the phone line, which maybe Pete, you've memorized the new number, but I haven't. But just head over to realagriculture.com and you can find it, or of course on Twitter at Wheat Pete, and we do share it there as well. This gentleman has been a fantastic time, and I did learn a few things, so that means it was time well spent. So thank you so much for entertaining all the questions and for all your knowledge and for sharing of your time. I do appreciate it.
Thanks, Lyndsey. Thanks,
awesome.
Pete. Much
Thanks,
appreciated.
All right, and that's our show. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you to everyone who hopped on in the comments. As Ray mentioned, if you didn't get the answer that you needed, or you have a follow-up, do reach out, get in touch with us. We will connect you with the person who might have that answer. And of course, you can find us at Real Agriculture on Twitter and social media. And you can always weigh in there, or watch for the upcoming Wheat School episode with Wheat Pete and Joanna Fallings, tackling this nitrogen question on wheat. And of course, head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow and make sure you sign up for your continuing education unit questions. And that's our show. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.